Welcome to Chapter 7, Social and Personality Development in Infancy. In every culture, babies show similar facial expressions relating to basic emotions. Nonverbal expression of emotion, nonverbal encoding is what it's called, nonverbal encoding. It's fairly consistent among people of all ages. And when they did some research, they asked some moms about their babies, their children's nonverbal behavior. And by the age of 1, most mothers say they have seen, by the age of 1 month, most mothers say they have seen their babies express interest, express joy. 84% of mothers think their infants have expressed anger. 75% say they've seen their baby surprised. 58% have seen fear, and 34% say they have seen sadness. So moms tend to be, or at least think, they're pretty in tune to their infants' emotions, although there's definitely individual differences in how responsive babies are emotionally. So even though babies do seem and appear to show their nonverbal emotions similarly, they may or may not actually be the same as an adult. Some may be just like a knee-jerk reaction, and so it appears to be that way. But babies are born with an innate repertoire of emotional expression and how they show their emotions. Do babies have jealousy? It's interesting to think about whether or not an infant can experience an emotion such as jealousy. In your textbooks on page 172, there's a little piece called Do Infants Experience Jealousy? From Research to Practice, and it shows a little experiment on testing whether or not babies do or do not sense jealousy or feel jealousy. So you might take a look at that piece. Stranger anxiety and separation anxiety are two important concepts in infancy. Stranger anxiety is when infants get uncomfortable around strangers, but that stranger doesn't have to actually be a stranger. It could be grandma, but you're a year old and you haven't seen grandma in 6 months, and here's this woman and she grabs you and hugs and kisses you and seems to know you, but you don't know her. And so stranger anxiety doesn't necessarily mean the person has to be a stranger. It's just someone who's unfamiliar to the child. It's also depending on who the person is. Children are most comfortable with other children. After that would be women. After that would be men. And then they tend to be most uncomfortable and anxious around men with facial hair. So that's sort of an interesting, when you think about maybe facial hair, they can't see the whole face. So that kind of talks about the interest level and comfort level of babies with other people. Stranger anxiety is also a positive, though, because what it shows is a baby's memory. It shows increase in memory because now baby knows who they do know and who they don't know. And so it's considered, even though it's upsetting for a child, it's actually considered a positive in some ways because it's showing that they are developing some memory. Stranger anxiety begins around 6 months. Separation anxiety is when a baby gets upset or distressed when their primary caregiver leaves. This begins around 8 or 9 months and it peaks around 14 months. And so part of it could be related to object permanence. Maybe they don't realize, oh my goodness, I can't see the person. Are they going to come back? And so depending how much time babies spend with their primary caregiver, whether they're in daycare or preschool, or if they're in an environment where they're around a lot of other people, the stranger anxiety and the separation anxiety can be dependent on those particular issues as well. This chart is in your book. It's on page 173, and it looks at children crying when you think about when their mother departs and the age. It looks at the African Bushmen. It looks at Antigua, Guatemala, and it looks at Israeli kibbutzes. In Israeli kibbutzes, children are raised as a group all together, and so when they reach a certain age, they're housed not with their parents, but as a group. And so one of the interesting things with that is when they're around a lot of other people and a lot of children a lot, would that mean they'd tend to have less separation anxiety from their primary caregiver? Social smile. I don't know if you've ever been around a newborn baby or a really young baby and someone says, oh, the baby smiled, and then there's always someone who says, oh no, it's not really a smile, it's gas. Well, a social smile has to be directed at another person. Social smile, so if a baby sees a toy and they smile at the toy, that's not a social smile. By the age of 6 to 9 weeks, some people say 12 weeks, babies tend to begin to smile at things that please them. This is in your book. It could be a toy, it could be a mobile, but one of the things we find is that babies tend to, early on, be not particular at what they smile at, but we do know that the human face is a very attractive thing to babies, and they do tend to smile at the human face more than anything else. By 18 months, they tend to direct much more towards mothers and other caregivers, and they tend to smile more frequently towards human objects or humans more than inanimate objects. Fairly early on, babies begin to be able to decode and understand other people's facial and vocal expressions. They seem to be able to understand vocal expression a little bit earlier than facial expression. So if they hear a voice being upset or they hear people fight, parents fighting and things like that, they often you'll see a reaction from the child that shows their emotions related to it. And then later on, the facial expression. So if you when a parent and child are having an interaction, babies are very likely to smile back if they see a parent smile. It's actually a very unhealthy situation when you have a depressed parent who has a flat affect where they're not smiling and a child's not seeing their primary caregivers happy. It can actually have a negative impact on that child's emotions. Social referencing. Social referencing is when a person, and we're talking in this chapter about babies, looks to another person, it's usually a caregiver, to see how to respond to a certain kind of situation. It begins around 8 or 9 months. So for example, a baby is crawling and they fall or they hurt themselves, and the parent or caregiver panics. Oh no, are you okay? The baby tends to look to the parent. If the parent doesn't seem like everything's okay, then the baby's more likely to cry and even physically feel pain. But if the parent, oh, you're fine, everything's fine, the baby's more likely to think it's fine. This can also happen with a stranger. So if a strange person walks into a room and the baby looks at the stranger and they don't know whether they should be afraid or not, they may look to their caregiver, and if the caregiver looks anxious about the stranger, they'll probably be anxious as well. But if their caregiver gives the person a big hug and, oh, it's Uncle Joe, how are you, and very warm and fuzzy, then the baby is more likely to be comfortable with that person. Self-awareness. Do infants know who they are? Well, around 17 months to 2 years old, children begin to show that they are aware of what their own capabilities are. Culture can have an impact on this as well. And what they do to test this is called the mirror and rouge task. So they put a baby up to a mirror and they put rouge on the child's, or blush or jelly or anything, on the child's face. And when the child looks in the mirror, the question is, does the child know that the person in the mirror is him or herself, or do they think it's another baby? So if they go to the mirror and try to wipe the jelly or rouge off the baby in the mirror, then chances are they think that person in the mirror is a different person from himself or herself. If they try to wipe it off of their own face, it shows they know the person in the mirror is herself or himself. So the mirror and rouge task is one way to assess self-awareness. Theory of mind is our knowledge and our belief about how our mind works and how it affects other people's behavior. Theory of mind is a concept that people who are on the autism spectrum have a really hard time with. And it's knowing that what goes on in somebody else's head is different from what goes on in my head. And so other people don't see things the same way I do. Babies start to see others as compliant agents, and that they realize they have power over them in a way. And that if they cry, they can get someone to do something. It's kind of an empowering thing when you think about it. Empathy is emotional response that corresponds to the feeling of another. If you think of sympathy as feeling bad for someone, and empathy as feeling what the other person is feeling. And empathy has to be taught. I believe it has to be taught when we teach children to have understanding for other people, teaching them empathy. If someone's hurt, saying, oh, do you see that this person is hurt, and kind of teaching them how to put their hand on someone else's shoulder and be an empathetic person. I strongly believe it is something children need to be taught, and it doesn't necessarily come naturally. Children begin to form relationships very early on, and that bond they form is really important. When we think about attachment is the bond we usually tend to have with the people who care for us. In your book, starting on page 177, they talk about the Ainsworth Strange situation, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and we'll talk about that in class as well. But there's also an image in your book on page 177, and it's about Harry Harlow. So just to back up for a minute, Harry Harlow did an experiment with baby monkeys, and he set up a cloth pretend monkey and a wire pretend monkey, and the wire one held the bottle, and the soft one didn't, and he thought that do babies only attach with their mothers and bond with their mothers because of milk, and if you'll find or is it the warmth and the comfort? So if you take a look on page 177 in your book, you can find the answer to that, and if you remind me, we can talk about it in class as well. The Ainsworth Strange situation is talked about on page 177 and 178, and we'll talk about that in class. It's a series of scenes, a pattern that they put a mother and child in a room with a stranger, and the mother leaves, and there's a whole series of steps. It's on page 178, and there's 4 attachment patterns that Mary Ainsworth came up with, and we'll talk more about these in class, and they kind of show how strong the attachment is between the mother and the child. So in a secure attachment pattern, when the mother leaves, the child uses the mother as a home base, and the mother's can easily appease the child. In an avoidant one, when the mother leaves, the child's angry and doesn't seek proximity with the child. Ambivalent shows kind of a combination of positive and negative. And then disorganized, disoriented, which kind of can overlap with the ambivalent in some ways, but it's contradictory behavior. So mothers tend to be in tune to their parents' needs, and children need that from their parents. Mothers, going back to mothers for a minute, mothers tend to be sensitive to their children's needs. They tend to be the primary caregiver, and they tend to play a lot of verbal games with their children. Fathers tend to have a slightly different kind of relationship with children. Although equally important, fathers tend to play more rough and tumble games. Mothers tend to be more of the verbal, like peekaboo kind of games. So fathers tend to do more of a physical kind of activity when playing with children. Babies can have different kinds of relationships with different people, and their attachments can vary with the different relationships that they have. When we talk about the parent-child relationship, the mutual regulation model looks at the back and forth dynamic between child and parent and how they respond to each other. So things like patty cake, where there's a back and forth and a turn-taking, that's related to the mutual regulation model. Reciprocal socialization, again, is when the infant has behavior that gets the parent or caregiver to respond even more and gets them more of that back and forth dialogue. This is in your book on page 183. It's a sequence of infant-caregiver interactions, so you can take a look at that. Babies love other babies. They say imitation is the highest form of flattery, and babies are very likely to imitate other babies when they are around them. There's a lot of things that can cause individual differences, whether it be gender, whether it be how they're raised, whether it be culture. There's a lot of different things that can affect and impact how babies have different kinds of personalities. We talked about Erikson back in chapter 2, and the 2 stages related to infancy would be trust versus mistrust, and autonomy versus shame and doubt. These are talked about in your book on page 185, and we can talk about them in class the next time we meet. Temperament. Some people believe you're born with your temperament. Some people think it can change, but it's the way things affect you. It's sort of not what happens to you, but it's how you react and why you react to those things. These are some of the dimensions of temperament: how active we are, whether we withdraw when we're approached, how adaptable we are, our mood, our attention span, how distractible we are. These are all related to our temperament. The book talks about easy babies, difficult babies, and slow to warm up babies. These are talked about in your book on page 186, and we can talk about those in class as well. The most important thing, though, about a baby's temperament is goodness of fit, and that's the fit of the caregiver and how well they meet the needs of the child. I want to make sure we talk in class about gender, our sense of maleness and femaleness, and how that can impact children, so make sure we talk about that in class. This chart looks at how children are cared for inside and outside of the home. This is also in your book, and we will This is on page 189 in your textbook. And then there's more about how we choose infant care and the importance of that, which is also in your book. Have a great week.